الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. ولا تحسبن الله غافلا عما يعمل الظالمون إنما يؤخرهم ليوم تشخص فيه الأبصار مهطعين مقنعي رؤوسهم لا يرتد إليهم طرفهم وأفئدتهم هواء وأنذر الناس يوم يأتيهم العذاب فيقول الذين ظلموا ربنا أخرنا إلى أجل قريب نجب دعوتك ونتبع الرسل أولم تكونوا أقسمتم من قبل ما لكم من زوال وسكنتم في مساكن الذين ظلموا أنفسهم وتبين لكم كيف فعلنا بهم وضربنا لكم الأمثال وقد مكروا مكرهم وعند الله مكرهم وإن كان مكرهم لتزول منه الجبال فلا تحسبن الله مخلف وعده رسله إن الله عزيز ذو انتقام يوم تبدل الأرض غير الأرض والسماوات وبرزوا لله الواحد القهار وترى المجرمين يومئذ مقرنين في الأصفاد سرابيلهم من قطران وتغشى وجوههم النار ليجزي الله كل نفس ما كسبت إن الله سريع الحساب هذا بلاغ للناس ولينذروا به وليعلموا أنما هو إله واحد وليذكر أولو الألباب. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. والفجر وليال عشر والشفع والوتر والليل إذا يسر هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بعاد إرم ذات العماد التي لم يخلق مثلها في البلاد وثمود الذين جابوا الصخر بالواد وفرعون ذي الأوتاد الذين طغوا في البلاد فأكثروا فيها الفساد فصب عليهم ربك صوت عذاب إن ربك لبالمرصاد فأما الإنسان إذا ما ابتلاه ربه فأكرمه ونعمه فيقول ربي أكرمن وأما إذا ما ابتلاه فقدر عليه رزقه فيقول ربي أهانن كلا بل لا تكرمون اليتيم ولا تحاضون على طعام المسكين وتأكلون التراث أكلا لما وتحبون المال حبا جما كلا إذا دكت الأرض دكا دكا وجاء ربك والملك صفا صفا وجيء يومئذ بجهنم يومئذ يتذكر الإنسان وأنى له الذكرى يقول يا ليتني قدمت لحياتي فيومئذ لا يعذب عذابه أحد ولا يوثق وثاقه أحد يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحانه. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. استغفر الله استغفر الله استغفر الله.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We request all the brothers to stay behind, brothers and sisters, and after the Sunnah prayer there will be lecture by Samba.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers. We're just going to commence with the talk now, inshallah ta'ala. If everyone can gather around or come closer, and we'll start, inshallah. Our host for tonight's lecture is our brother Bilal, inshallah. So Bilal will take mic, inshallah.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته, brothers and sisters. What was I going to say? Today we have our Hidayah series, alhamdulillah. We're joined here by brother Sam, and the brothers in KRC have never failed when it comes to giving us talks here. Alhamdulillah, may Allah reward them. I pray that Allah keeps the consistency of the talks here at Kilburn Islamic Center. I also pray that Allah keeps us united and reunites us in Jannatul Firdaus al-A'la. Hidayah series is a monthly talk we have here in Kilburn Islamic Centre, where we open a platform for our Muslim revert brothers, where they share their story and their journey towards Islam. And alhamdulillah, it is amazing because we aim to motivate the non-Muslims that are here or that may not be here to take their shahada, inshallah, where we warmly welcome them to Islam. Today we have our beloved brother Sam, who will be talking to us about his journey to Islam, along with other benefits he will be providing us with. Sam is also a brother who speaks multiple languages, including Arabic, which he also teaches, Somali, Bengali, and also Spanish. Si, senor?
Si, senor.
Alhamdulillah, without further ado, Sam will be taken over. Jazakallah khair.
Is this one mine as well, akhi? Okay, jazakallah khairan. Okay, bismillah. I'd like to start, inshallah, by pondering over an ayah, first of all. And I'd like to think about this ayah as we kind of go through the story, because there's a tendency when we hear about how an individual came to Islam and to think that it's all about them, to think that they are kind of the main character of the story, but really the Quran is the main character of the story. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Hadid, ayah number 9, هو الذي ينزل على عبده آيات بينات ليخرجكم من الظلمات إلى النور. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He is the one who has sent down clear signs upon His slave to take you from the darkness into the light. So without further ado, I'll give you my story of how Allah has sent down verses that take from darkness into the light. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We usually start with that, don't we? But my name's Sam. Has anybody heard of me before, by the way? Like, see my podcast on my YouTube channel or anything like that? It's always painful when I ask rooms that. 3 or 4 people, alhamdulillah. Okay, well, what about, and I'm from a place called Cornwall. Have any of you heard of Cornwall before? Hands up if you've heard of a place called Cornwall. Okay, good. Cornwall's a bit more famous than me. Walillah alhamd. Okay, good. So I'm from a place called Cornwall. For those of you who haven't been there, it's not very close to London. It'll take you about 6 hours to get there probably from here. And if you've been to Cornwall, you'll notice that most people there look like me and less like most of the people in this room. When I actually embraced Islam, there was only one masjid there, and the Muslim community was maybe only 100 or so. Most of the community down there are people who are Bangladeshis who have gone there to start restaurants. That's most of the community down there. So that's where the journey starts for me. It starts in Cornwall. I'd never actually met a Muslim in my life when I first heard the Quran. So maybe I'll share a little bit about maybe my background and you know, where I'm kind of coming from, because that's significant, what your parents teach you growing up and things like that. So I was brought up, I guess, in the darkness of an absence of knowing about a creator. Technically, we were sort of Christians, kind of a vague Church of England that lots of English people are, especially kind of working class English people. So I knew that there kind of was a religion. We talked about God before, but even mentioning things like praying or like angels or like a creator would have been a conversation stopper at dinner time. Like that wasn't something that I was brought up to even care about or even question at all. Like, it was really what atheists want the world to be like, is what I kind of grew up in. As I say, like, I grew up in a darkness of an absence of a creator, of a purpose. And when I was about 17, I went to there's only a couple of colleges in Cornwall, one called Truro College. I mean, Truro is our only city there, actually. Most of Cornwall is just like fishing villages and farming villages and stuff. But we do have one city where there's a college, and completely not by coincidence at all really, by deliberate planning by Allah Azza wa Jal, one of the things I wanted to study was another language. I wanted to study German, but it turned out that I was terrible at that, as I was in all languages at that point. And they said, that's not a very good idea. Why don't you do something you do know something about? And that was religious studies, because I'd done well in it at school. So completely, it's kind of out of my hands really, that was sort of put upon me. So I had the opportunity to study a lot of world religions. I studied Taoism and Buddhism and Hinduism and various denominations of Christianity, etc. And when I came across Islam, unlike the other religions that are mostly about a person, Buddhism, Christianity, or about a place, Hinduism, etc., Islam I saw as something so universal. Like, it's purely submission to the one creator, regardless of your age or your background or what you used to believe or where you come from. So I was kind of in this position where I'm learning about Islam. I didn't even know any Muslims, right? I sort of knew of a guy who was a Muslim, but he was like a friend of a friend. So I'd never met any Muslims. And in my head, I'm thinking Muslims believe sort of the same as Hinduism. I thought it was as different to what I'd grown up knowing as maybe Hinduism or Buddhism. And it really changed from being a situation where I was studying Islam to a position where I couldn't really ignore it and just kind of put it in a box or something I was studying anymore. When one of my professors who was teaching Islam to me at the time, non-Muslim as well, she was actually a Jewish lady. We didn't have any Muslim teachers who were teaching us Islam at the time. She sent this assignment around to our class for us to listen to some verses of the Quran and just think about what it might make a Muslim feel like. Of course, none of us in the class are believing Muslims or anything. And that's when everything changed for me. Obviously, I open up my laptop and I go into Quran Explorer. I don't know what any of these surah are. I've never heard of a Baqarah before, and I don't know why there's one called a bumblebee and stuff. And obviously, we come from a literary tradition of reading books from start to finish, right? That's like what all of our literature is like. That's what the Bible's like. It begins in the beginning and it ends in the book of Revelation, where there's at the end, right? So I thought that's what you do with the Quran. So I go to Surah Al-Baqarah and I listen to Surah Al-Baqarah. Of course, I've never heard sounds like Ayn and Sad and Qaf and Dad before in my life, and even less likely or chance there was of me being able to pronounce them or understand them at all, given that I was just dreadful at languages throughout school and college. But that really didn't matter anymore. It didn't really matter that I'd struggled at things before. It didn't really matter that it felt far off. It was that this thing needs to be learnt about. That this thing can't be ignored anymore. It was something that replaced anything that I might want to listen to again. Like, it replaced a need for music in my life. It replaced a need for poetry in my life even. And I found myself, I'm probably 16, maybe 17 years old at this point, primarily listening to the Quran. Like, I had a job doing a paper round in my village in Cornwall, and I had one of those iPods. Some of you guys remember we had like the little iPod shuffles before we had phones and stuff. My iPod shuffle was just full of Surah Al-Baqarah. I don't know if I could get much more than Surah Al-Baqarah on it at that time. So I'm going to college and I'm going through my studies and stuff as usual, but I've fallen in love with the Quran, and purely just the sound and the melody of the Quran. And it only really dawns on me like a few months later that you can even become a Muslim. That's not an obvious thing to everybody who's learning about Islam. Like, we should remember that in our da'wah. Sometimes we might have a discussion with somebody about Islam for an hour or 2 hours and actually forget to invite them to Islam. Actually we neglect to realize that they maybe haven't actually thought that you can become a Muslim or that it's particularly important to. And I didn't have anybody around me like that. As I say, there was one individual who I knew of, but he didn't make the time to come and speak to me. So I realized that it's probably quite important to learn Arabic if you love the Quran this much. Obviously, as I say, I haven't even sort of realized that you can become a Muslim. That wasn't really even on my mind at the time. It was just, this is a beautiful book in which there's no doubt. So I enrolled in this Arabic class at my college taught by a Lebanese woman. And, I'd kind of had like a hostility, I guess, or an unease about approaching a mosque, because I knew that we had one in Cornwall, or an Islamic center rather. I knew we had one because we had Google Maps at that point. But I mean, if you've never met Muslims, how do you know if they're going to be Shias or they're going to be Sufis, or you hear all this stuff about these different kind of groups of Muslims, so how do you know who they are? But I met this woman, a Lebanese woman, who was the Arabic teacher, and she just had a good impact on me. I told her, I love this Quran. I don't know everything about what it says yet. I have an English translation of it, but that's not the thing I've fallen in love with in and of itself. It's actually the melody and just the beauty of this book. And she put me in contact with that mosque there, down in Cornwall. I asked that Allah Azza wa Jal bless the brothers who've established that masjid in Cornwall, because that is the most southern masjid in the whole of the UK, and perhaps one of the most remote that we have in this whole country. I mean, Cornwall is an enormous county. I mean, maybe 500,000 people live there. That doesn't sound like a lot if you're from London, where there's 10 million or something silly here, but outside of London, 500,000 people in a big county, that's a big place. But one masjid. So serves a lot of people, and it's it's a huge blessing, it's a huge ni'mah that we have that place there. So I remember going there one day, and I'd learnt about these greetings that people say, Assalamu alaikum, and that people would say wa alaikum salam and say alhamdulillah and things like that to me. And I remember feeling a pressure that I had to say those things right. I remember going there and he was like assalamu alaikum, and I kind of interrupted him with assalamu alaikum. I thought, oh no. I was like, oh no, I'm gonna have to redo it again. But I'm just sharing some of these things because sometimes when you're raised upon Islam or you're more familiar with it, you maybe don't even consider some of the things that people who come to Islam as an adult might wrestle with, or some things if you correct them on it too abruptly or make them feel silly about it, then that might affect how they see the Muslims generally. Like this masjid isn't like it, but our one in Cornwall, it's laid out as if it's like individual prayer mats. Like here you've obviously got lines for the sufuf in here, but like I remember going into the masjid and thinking like I had my own, and that the first Jumu'ah I went to, and there was like someone like budging up close to me and stuff like that. That just wasn't something that people taught me about. So anyway, I come to this masjid, the Assalamu alaikum goes okay. And there's someone there who's willing to teach me Quran. Like at this point, I've memorized some Quran at this point. I'm a good few pages into Surah Al-Baqarah. I'm reciting it so much at home, and I'm trying to recite it. I remember kind of writing it down in sort of English letters, Alif, Lam, Mim, and writing out the letters in kind of English letters so I could follow along with it. And they just kind of assumed I was a Muslim. They assumed that I'd kind of taken my shahada and stuff like that. But when it got out that I hadn't, they snapped up that shahada quite quickly, alhamdulillah. But as well, that's another thing, like someone might be really in love with Islam, they might love the Quran, but they, like myself, they might not have thought that you need to take your shahada, or even if you do, maybe they just think that they've kind of done their shahada themselves in their heart or something, and they're a Muslim. But we should really take the initiative to inform new Muslims that take your shahada publicly, people know that you're a Muslim, people kind of welcome you into the community and things like that. So I had a teacher at this point. There was an Algerian man who actually had ijazah from Algeria, and I had the opportunity to sit with him and start learning Islam more and start learning the Quran more. I'm actually learning correct rules of tajweed and things like that. And I'm trying to think in my head like what the transition is really like, because all I've really told you is I just love the Quran and then I'm just kind of a Muslim. But there are things in between that. There's an experience of like my dad coming up the stairs and hearing me trying to recite the Quran in my bedroom. There's an experience of like me watching like a YouTube video about how to pray and stuff, and like my brother coming in and I'm like trying it out and stuff. There's all of these things in between that kind of give my family a warning that I'm thinking of becoming a Muslim. By the time I'd become a Muslim, by that point, my family all thought I had been a Muslim for like months, but by that point. So it wasn't like I'd taken my shahada and come home and it was a complete surprise out of the blue. Like I think that's something that we should that we should tell the brothers and sisters who we're giving da'wah to, that like your Islam doesn't need to be quite as abrupt as you might think it is in your head. Like, try to bring your family with you on that journey. Like that's something that I tried to do. And I know lots of other people who've embraced Islam in Cornwall and have sort of had more success in terms of shahadas doing that. So really after hearing the Quran, after studying more about what it meant, and after learning about the actual concept of tawheed generally, like what a simple principle this is. What a simple thing that we worship the Creator and not the creation. Like what a simple thing that is, yet how overlooked it is by so many kind of cultures and religions around the world. And we got to a point maybe, I think I would have been 17 because I was driving to the masjid, so I must have been 17. Although in Cornwall we don't really have the police, so some people maybe do drive younger than that, but I was 17 though, I promise. So this was the point when I took my shahada. At that point, I remember obviously it was on a Sunday where we kind of have our Quran classes at that masjid, and so it's mostly children there. I remember sitting at the front of the masjid and it being mostly children that were in front of me. There was like 12 5-year-olds and a couple of adults. So from then on, it's really just me by myself. Like as I mentioned, like when I came home and said to my dad, like I took my shahada today, I'm actually a Muslim now. He was like, of course you are. Like we sort of all knew you were. And despite not being great at languages, as I've mentioned, I didn't really see that as a reason to not learn Arabic and to not learn the Quran. It wasn't a case of like, I'm this person and I struggle at this. It was, this thing needs to be learned, so let's learn it. And of course there's a huge amount of just making dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it easier for us to pronounce the Quran as well. That's a big challenge from people who come from sort of my background, maybe don't learn any other languages at home, get to sort of 17, 18 years old and now need to learn Arabic, like Ayn and Sad and Qaf and Ghayn, they're not the friendliest of sounds for you to try to make with an English face. But with the dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and persistence with it, we ask that Allah make it easy for us and for other people who are close to embracing Islam or are already upon it. So I decided I'd do an Arabic language degree. As I say, not because I was great at languages, but because it needed to be done. So most of the rest of my time in Cornwall when I'm sort of 18 years old is just studying for that. It's just making sure that we do that, and that's how I've ended up in London. So I went to a university in central London, did an Arabic language degree there. And first year of an Arabic language degree, if any of you guys are interested in doing one, they really just beat Fusha into you for like a whole year. It's like 100 words a week and maybe more. I've forgotten now because it was a while ago now. But that's basically all you do for the first year. Second year, you move on to some texts. You'll do, some modern Arabic poetry. You'll maybe do, some things like that. But it's another thing to bear in mind for Muslims in this country who are considering like an academic path of studying Islam and Arabic. Like the people who are teaching you, they're not teaching you Nawaqid al-Islam, they're not teaching you like classical Islamic books. They're really teaching you a refutation of Islam if you do Islamic studies. And coming from Cornwall and having only ever met some Muslims in my life, that threw me off quite a lot. That the teachers, the first things they were introducing us to were things like naskh, what's the English word? Is it abrogation? Abrogation, yeah. Things like that are kind of some challenging topics, even for like believing Muslims who have been studying for a long time to grasp. So anyway, I directed most of my modules towards just the studies of the Arabic language. And it was in my third year, so year one is really just beating Fusha into you for a year. Year two, you get to pick modules on literature and whatever else you're interested in. Year three, you do a year abroad. So when I applied for that degree, the options were Damascus and Cairo, and I was accepted for my Arabic degree in 2011. So going to Syria at that time became difficult for us. So the options that were available when it came to be my opportunity were Palestine and Jordan. And between those two countries, in terms of your Arabic language learning opportunities, Palestine, in my opinion, even until now, is a much more favorable one, because there's many countries, even like in the UAE and stuff like that, where you can get by if you want to using English. That's not really possible in Palestine. So I studied Arabic literature at a university called Jami'at al-Najah in a city called Nablus in the West Bank for a year. And that gave me an opportunity to go from the fishing village that I'm from in Cornwall to an actual Muslim environment. Actually being able to hear the adhan 5 times a day, going to a completely Arabic-speaking university. Like most of my professors didn't speak English, and the friends that I made there didn't speak English. And reflecting on it now, the main lesson that I get from it is to think about why we're still here, really. Most of us are here for reasons like work or education or whatever it might be. But we pay a big price for that by choosing not to be in a Muslim country. We pay a really big price. For those of you who have children, I have 2 little boys who are in school now. And those of you who have children, even if you don't, you know that we pay a big price to be in this country and to not be in a place where a haram lifestyle is harder. And you, as I say, you hear the adhan 5 times a day and things like that. So when I was on my year abroad, when you do a degree, you're supposed to do a dissertation at some point or another, usually in your final year. But I did one when I was on my 3rd year, when I was in Palestine. I wrote one in Arabic. And I wrote mine on a travel writing called Rihlat Ibn Jubayr. Any of you heard of Ibn Jubayr before? Or Ibn Battuta? Even Ibn Battuta is a bit more known. Or Ibn Fadlan? No, okay. Well, anyway, I wrote my dissertation on Ibn Jubayr, on his description of the Christians in his book. So when I came home, obviously I'd already done a dissertation, and so I'm in my final year. You usually do a dissertation in your final year, but my supervisor was like, don't do another dissertation, it's boring, obviously. Do Somali. My supervisor wasn't a Somali, right? He was actually a German man who was, like, Arabic language specialist, but he sort of said, look, you're at a university that teaches Hausa and Somali and Swahili, like, why not learn one? And obviously being in London, like, I'd met Somalis, like, not at the university I went to, there wasn't loads of Somalis, but I'd met Somalis and I'd heard them speak their language, and I was like, well, that's nothing like Arabic, but some of the pronunciation I thought was kind of similar, so I thought, let's give it a whirl. And so I had the opportunity to learn Somali at like a university level for a year, and whilst I was at university, that kind of led me into meeting the woman who's my wife now, who's a Somali. And I'm trying to think about the important details, really. So I graduated in 2015, Arabic language degree, year of Somali, and I'm living in London as a primary school teacher. It was actually what I started my career out in. Some of you guys who have been to uni, you might know a somewhat prestigious graduate program called Teach, with the word first after it. You might have heard of that. I don't know if you need to cut things like that if I mention companies and stuff, so I'll put it a little bit cryptic. Anyway, I was terrible at my job. I was just awful primary school teacher. There's no sugarcoating it. I was just terrible at my job. Really, like, primary school teachers, your main job is really sort of, they shouldn't actually call you a teacher. They should call you like education admin monkey who teaches for like a few hours a day. Like primary school teachers who are training as well, certainly in my case, I was probably doing 12 hours a day. 5 hours of which were actually in the classroom teaching students. And things like marking, going to these meetings and stuff, I was just not very good at them. And my school, I taught at a school in East London. That's majority Muslim. I mean, like, the Ofsted report alone read that maybe 60% of the school are Pakistanis, and my class was full of Bengalis and Somalis and stuff as well in East London. So I don't know why the school made it so difficult to pray Jumu'ah, but they had that as like a categorical, you cannot pray Jumu'ah when you're working at this school. In primary school, it's a little bit harder because the kids' lunchtime is at like a different time to like secondary schoolers. If you teach in a secondary school, it's a bit easier to pray Jumu'ah because the kids are praying as well in a school like that, but they're often not in a primary school. So I left, and this is kind of when I started creating content online about learning Somali. Like, I was going through this process at the moment with my wife where I'm learning sort of her language and her family's language, and learning a lot more than I did when I was studying Somali at university. And so I thought, let's just make videos about this. Like, I was really aware that the process of creating, of like documenting a learning experience is often more interesting than learning a load of stuff and then presenting it. So that's how that channel started, and some people in the comment section affectionately started calling me Sam of Somalia. And then that just kind of became the name. And that still exists now, that channel's there now. I haven't put out content on it for maybe 2 years now, because I kind of emptied out my brain with everything I knew into it, and I thought, if I don't know anymore, then we shouldn't just speak for the sake of it. And at that same time as well was when I started teaching Arabic, so I've obviously got an Arabic language degree at this point, and I just kind of started teaching Arabic in East London, just going to people's houses and teaching their kids. And the program that I started to put together for those kids is what's now my flagship program, which is called the Arabic in 60 Steps program. We have just over 800 students now, alhamdulillah, all over the world. I can't think of a country that we don't have students in. And that's where we are. I don't know how much further than that to go, really. I don't know how we are for time, even. We're okay. Well, really, I've finished. So I don't know if you want to make it a bit more interactive. If there's anything you want to ask me, or actually, there's something I do want to say. Actually, so I did I was a guest on Iyera's Rerouted podcast as well, and I mentioned that I'd like learnt Bangla for a few weeks, and they put it as if I speak Bangla. And I'd like to just put a little disclaimer. I don't really speak Bangla. Like, I know like a few, I can read and write the script, and I can sort of say a few things, but I will kind of do myself a bit of justice, and I'll say, we'll take Bangla out of there, And let's put British Sign Language in, because I am fluent in British Sign Language though. My wife's actually hard of hearing, so Somali isn't actually the language we use at home. We use British Sign Language at home, so we can just... Makaton's kind of similar, right? Makaton, I think, is actually developed specifically for like children's learning. Yeah. It's specifically developed for that, but British Sign Language it's a language as much as English or Urdu or Spanish is, yeah. And so that's my wife's strongest language, is British Sign Language. So so we can swap out Bangla, and then even any of the other languages really. Like I get uncomfortable when people say, you know, "Af Somali hardly kara." Like I get nervous when people say that about me, because it's like, you know, if they're going to test me on certain stuff. Go ahead. No. Yeah. Like I'd put my understanding of Somali at quite a high level, but like I live in the UK and I use sign language at home with my family. Like I'm not in a position where I'm speaking Somali every day, but I'd say like I've studied it at like an academic level, and like I would say I'm all right at it. Is where I put myself, precisely all right. So I think last year was 10 years, so it's nearly 11 years now that I've been a Muslim now, alhamdulillah. Yeah. So I'm 28 now, and I think I was 17 when I like actually took my shahada, so it's about 11 years now. I've got a degree in it, and I sort of lived there so I would put that at a better than all right, but I don't want an imtihan, I don't want an exam on it, you know. Yeah, so like as part of my degree, there were modules in like specifically in the reading of the Quran and Hadith, as well as other Islamic texts. But I think like I remember when I first started learning Arabic, when I first heard the Quran, and I thought about how Arabs experience the Quran versus how non-Arabs experience the Quran. And I always thought it was like something binary, like you know Arabic, and then you sort of enter the matrix and you understand all of the Quran, but that the Quran is really its own thing to be studied in and of itself. Like you can be very, very competent in the Arabic language and still need to study things in the Quran. Like there's things in the Quran that even some of the most advanced Arabic texts won't teach. Like there's verb forms and stuff that exist in the Quran, which I was having this discussion with some of my graduates recently. That there's a term used in Surah Al-Rahman, for example, mudahammatan. There's this word that's used that's like a description of the gardens in Jannah. And this word, like actually describing the grammar of where this word comes from, is way more complicated than just learning the word. Like usually when we learn Arabic, we should learn rules, because the rules are easier than learning the 500 verbs that behave like it. Like we learn a rule, then we can apply it. But just to answer the question though, it's like, I'm confident in Arabic that's commonly used throughout the Quran, but even though I'm a graduate in the Arabic language, like I'll come across terms like that I'll need to look up in and of themselves. But much like I guess many native Arabic speakers do, they might come across something and of course need to read it with tafsir as well.
And obviously, Allah has given you Hidayah from Cornwall. There must be a reason behind that whole thing. So I'm just asking.
Yeah, like I haven't, since I've been, of the time I've been a Muslim, very little of it has been me living in Cornwall. Obviously I've been in London for most of it and Palestine for some of it. But when I am there, yeah, I have even to like my immediate family and stuff like that, like Like that there is a real need and a benefit for people from among them to be giving them da'wah. But there's also other people like me. Like I'm not the only one from Cornwall who's like myself. Like there's some brothers there who are way more Cornish than me. Like there are some brothers who've embraced Islam and like even their families have come to Islam and they're like farmers. Like they're not, like because I'm not really fully Cornish because I was actually born in Northampton and we moved to Cornwall. So like the Cornish wouldn't consider me Cornish. Like I'm not a Cornish speaker and stuff like that. Because there is an indigenous language in Cornwall, by the way. Like the Cornish language is like, they have their own identity and their own thing down there in Cornwall, which I'm not really part of. But those guys who are, they do really good da'wah down there. There's actually a really fascinating bit of history that most people don't know about is that there's actually a poem written by a king in like the 14th century in the Cornish language, which is in praise of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. On one of my YouTube channels, I do a reading of it in Cornish, and I do a translation from the Cornish into Arabic, and then I do a recitation of it in Arabic as well. So if you want to hear what Cornish sounds like, then that might be of interest to you. No, good, inshallah. Do.
With regards to the Arabic language, because I've seen your video on some of Kamil Kenadi stuff, so could you say like the benefit with like what kind of place children's stories took from your learning?
Yeah, I'd say almost zero, really. Okay, a lot of, like,
I'm a self-learner.
yeah.
And I did the Medina books,
Mhm.
and I've only been doing children's stories.
Yeah.
And I've benefited a lot on it. So
Lots of my students do, right? Lots of my students do, but I think that there's things written by adults for adults which still have very accessible language. Like there are like the Oxford Readers Arabic books and things like that. That I have for my children and stuff as well. Like there are things like that that are very beneficial. But I even think like there's novels like I do a few lessons on the blurb from one of Ghassan Kanafani's books, A'id ila Haifa, and even though that's a novel for adults about something very adult, like the language is so accessible, I think, almost as accessible as some of these children's books. But actually, the Qasas al-Nabiyyin, that book, like my students love that book. Like that book is like a companion to my program. Students love that. Like they love when I do walkthroughs of whole stories of prophets in there. But I'd say like in my experience of my students, great impact and they love it. Mine personally, not a lot. That's the answer. So in terms of like riwayat, so Ghassan Kanafani, as I mentioned, in terms of like poetry, even I think even some of Nizar Qabbani's modern poetry is quite accessible. But for someone who's done all three of the Medina books, yeah. So someone who's done all three of the Medina books with a dictionary next to you just for the vocab, because like there's vocab that Nizar Qabbani would use that wouldn't be in the Medina books, as you can imagine. So like with a dictionary with you, those I think are pretty accessible in my opinion.
English Arabic dictionary or like a Ma'an, something like Arabic?
No, English Arabic for that. To be honest, for most of what I teach, like, there are huge dictionaries, of course, like Arabic to Arabic dictionaries, Taj al-Arus and Lisan al-Arab and stuff. Like they're way beyond the scope that I teach to any of my students. Like I think students get to a real meaningful command over the Arabic language and can access meaningful texts without needing to quite get to that level, in my experience.
Two questions from the sisters. One is, one sister wants to ask about your 60 steps to the Arabic, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
How did you do it? And she thinks she wants to learn more about it and maybe accept Islam. So that's the journey about the 60 steps you mentioned.
Okay, well, so she's a non-Muslim considering embracing Islam. Okay. Okay, she should email my team at sam@arabic60steps.com and we'll look at sponsoring her, so she can do the program for free. We'll look at doing that for her. But she can go to arabic60steps.com and all the information will be on there.
So another sister wants to know how would you, as a sister, she also memorization, or what's it take to memorize it? So she's having lack of difficulty. What are your tips?
So something which I neglected a lot in my own hifz was just neglecting sitting with the mushaf. Like sometimes we kind of convince ourselves, and I know I did for a long time, just listening to the Quran like just listen to the Quran a lot and try to follow along. But the thing that always happened with me is like there's some ayat in some surah that are similar to other parts, and I find myself getting halfway through Surah Al-Takwir and there's something that sounds like something from the middle of Surah Al-Qiyamah or something. So actually sitting with the Mus'haf, especially if you're more of a visual learner, like sitting with the Mus'haf and looking at it. Like in my memory of Surah Al-Baqarah, like I try to remember like the first ayah, and I kind of do it like that, like إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا سَوَاء is the next one, and then the next page is like the first line of each of the pages. That really helped me.
Step by step, take it easy.
Yeah, like doing it by page. The Quran is so well organized like that. Like that there's like 20 pages per juz, 10 pages per hizb, like 30 juz in the Quran, and we should make use of that. Like I think you actually sit. That's why I say it's actually sitting with the Mus'haf and actually using it is something that we shouldn't neglect. But I'll be transparent and say I'm not a teacher of that though. Like I don't claim to be a teacher of tajweed or of memorizing the Quran generally. But so it's entirely anecdotal. That's just my experience.
They're fascinating about your journey and all that, so they just want to know a bit more. So that's why they ask.
Good.
So,
Alhamdulillah. Good.
do you have any more questions?
What would you say in terms of when you became Muslim, what were the main challenges as a Muslim when you came to Salah or specifically the ibadah that you found very difficult, very kind of challenging?
So I'm not a person to really bow to the whims of the people around me saying that this isn't cool or this isn't right. In my head, it was that Islam is the haqq, and that's it. Like that was really it for me. So it wasn't like people were calling me names or so. I was 17, so my big brother was 19. So he's still like in a sort of stage of his life where he's just like a bit of a lad, really, and he's sort of like, well, he just openly mocked me, really. And my little sister's 5 years younger than me, so she doesn't really know what's going on. And I'm as I mentioned, I'm from like a fishing village in Cornwall. I used to have a job making Cornish pasties in the bakery, like exactly what you'd want Sam to be from Cornwall. That's sort of what I was, and everyone knows each other in a village like that. Like sometimes when brothers from London, they tell me like back in Bangladesh, like I'm from whatever village, Burr, or like brothers from Somalia, they're from this place or whatever, like, and they say like I'm sort of from the village. I think of like my village in Cornwall like that. So I experienced all of those things, but that wasn't the hardest. The thing that was the hardest was the doubt in myself that I was saying the right things to people. Like, I've kind of talked about my journey a little bit with the first sort of 10 pages of Surah Al-Baqarah. And without any context, without the opportunity for me to go and learn things like asbab and nuzul, like the reasons why certain things were revealed, and context around these ayat, like there's things that really scared me. Looking at those first ayats there, for example. وَإِذَا خَلَوْا إِلَى شَيَاطِينِهِمْ قَالُوا إِنَّا مَعَكُمْ. That when like the hypocrites would go back to their shayateen, their evil ones, or however you like to translate that, and they say, indeed we're with you. Like I found myself in situations where I'd be learning about Islam, and I'd say things to my family like, but I'm still one of you. I'd say like, Dad, I'm still part of your family, I'm still one of you. And like without the knowledge, I remember thinking to myself, is Allah speaking about people like me? Like, is Allah speaking about people like me when I'm learning about Islam and I'm praying when I'm among the Muslims? And then I'm going back to another group and saying, Inna ma'akum, that we're with you. And like, things like that worried me. Like, Allah is very stern about people kind of making up things about Allah. And وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنْ اِفْتَرَى عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا. Like, that's from Surah Al-Kahf, actually. But like, who is worse than the one who makes up lies about Allah? Yeah, there's a crude translation. I can't quote a translator who gives that translation, so you can look it up. But something along those lines. It was things like that worried me the most. It was me sitting and wondering may Allah protect us if I'm a hypocrite. It was that worried me more than anything.
Another sister is asking, was it easier to understand the Quran before memorizing it, or did you memorize it first? How did that?
Before memorizing it on a word-for-word basis. So you don't really need to have memorized the Quran to understand, to open the Mus'haf and to read it kind of word for word. But when you've memorized a significant portion of the Quran, you start to spot where a story is mentioned in one place and then carried on in another and things like that. So understanding like a broad picture of the Quran, understanding that comes with memorizing more of the Quran, definitely. Like true command over the Quran, like it's not by a coincidence that Allah has made us a people who memorize their book. Like when we look at other religions, most of them do not memorize their book like us. That's not by coincidence that we have a tradition of hifz, right? Like for us to have a meaningful understanding of the Quran, the people who are hafadh of the Quran, they have a stronger ability than others to piece things together in the Quran, to spot where certain things are repeated in one place and in another. And so that's what I'd say. So to have like a meaningful understanding of the Quran in general, memorizing the Quran massively helps with that.
Jazakallah khair. Does anyone else have any questions?
So I'm from a village called Goran Haven. That's the village where I grew up. My family live in St. Austell now. I think you've heard of it. Yeah, of course I do, yeah. Yes. Last time I went there probably would have been 7 years ago, maybe.
Did you see the scroll that says La ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammadan Rasulullah?
No. I've been told about that though. Subhanallah. Right, okay. Oh, mashallah. No, I've heard of things like that. Yeah, that is.
There's a scroll that was given in the 10th century to the English from Khalifa al-Mahdi, who's the great grandson, forgive me if I'm wrong, Harun al-Rashid.
Subhanallah. Like Cornwall, if you look at it on a map, it's not a surprise that Cornwall has had interactions with the Muslim world in ways that maybe the rest of the country hasn't. Like if you imagine like sailors from the Mediterranean Ocean who are Muslims from North Africa throughout the Middle Ages, if they're going to sail around Europe, then they're going to end up in Cornwall first. So like Cornwall has an interesting history like that. In fact, we even have a lot of like indigenous Cornish people who are as Cornish as you get. Like nobody questions whether these people are Cornish, who are like noticeably darker skinned than the rest of us. We affectionately call them Spanish pirates because we don't know what we're talking about. but I had a lot of friends when I was at college and at school and stuff who were like noticeably darker skinned, and perhaps they are descendants of people from North Africa who settled. But yeah.
In your opinion, what do you think all Muslims take for granted? Not really appreciate.
Exposure to the Quran at a young age is the first one. Like, I'm complicating it in my head a little bit because the born Muslims are not all the same. Do you know what I mean? Like, I've experienced people who have a name like Muhammad or Umar, and when I think about their exposure to Islam and the effort or lack thereof that their parents put into their upbringing, I think, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Yeah, I don't know. But generally I would say the blessing of having exposure to the Quran, and especially memory of it at a younger age, because it gets harder to memorize as you get older. I haven't really thought too much about that question though, but that's kind of just the first thing that comes to mind. Mm. So with the first question, as I mentioned, my family weren't upon a particular religion in a strong manner. Like they are real liberals in the sense of like, if you're doing something that doesn't hurt anybody, then do whatever you like. And whilst we don't subscribe to that belief, it served me in a way because they weren't aggressive or combative towards me. But I mean, they had their share of concerns because obviously with your children, you want them to be like you. Like all parents do. Subconsciously, we're a lot more kind of selfish than we like to admit. We like our children to be like us. But generally it was one of support, you know. And as I mentioned, we're from a village where people talk about that. Like I know women sat down for a coffee morning with my mum and said, like, aren't you ashamed of this? Like I know women did that, right? Like I know like my brother's mates at college and stuff. They said like, you know, your brother's a Muslim or whatever. I know those conversations happened, and I know that they stood up for me. I know they defended me, and like, I've got such a good relationship with the rest of my family now, and since being married and having children and stuff, and they see like I'm settled, it's gone okay. Like they don't even question now whether it could change. Like Sam's a Muslim and his kids are Muslims, and that's it now. So I don't get any challenge from them. Now it's kind of the other way around. Now it's us challenging them why they're not upon Tawheed and why they haven't taken their shahadas yet. So I suppose that's flipped a little bit. As for Palestine, so I was fortunate to be in a Muslim majority area which is generally conservative and practicing of Islam. Like I know of lots of people who go to Muslim majority or supposedly Muslim majority places, and their experience of the Muslims isn't the idealistic idea that they had. It's not like they don't meet the Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhum that they read about. Like they don't meet Muslims like that, you know. But my experience in Nablus was really good. Like generally, like of my friends who I was studying with, they were all people who prayed. Like they were all people who respected their parents. They were all people who would sit and would talk about the Quran in the masjid and stuff. Like so in Nablus specifically, the people and everything, I had an amazing experience there. But living in a place where there's an occupation, like that's something that that's rough. You know, like I would love to I'd love to take my wife and my children to Masjid al-Aqsa, like being able to experience that. Like Allah blessed me with a few opportunities to pray Jumu'ah there and to pray Tahajjud there and stuff as well when I was staying in the city. And I would love to take my wife and my children there, but you know, the way that you are treated and sometimes even humiliated at checkpoints and stuff, like it's one thing for me, but I don't know if I could see them do that to my wife or my children. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts on that.
That shouldn't stop anybody, because I went to me and my wife and 80 other people. We went just before the lockdown, and they did harass us at the checkpoints and all that. That should not be an issue. But it's a wonderful, wonderful country. Many things to learn.
You know, we lack tawakkul a little bit, don't we? Sometimes, Anyway, tfaddal.
Two questions.
Go ahead.
One for all from upstairs. What is the importance of learning tajweed with memorizing the Quran?
I suppose the importance can be summarized in if you memorize the Quran without good tajweed, it's much harder to unlearn that later. Like it's much better to have good tajweed and then memorize the Quran once rather than. It's kind of comparable to a lot of my students I have. Some of the most challenging students I have are native Arabic speakers. Like some of the most challenging students I've ever had are like Libyans and Algerians and Moroccans who like speak Arabic, right? But like they're so used to speaking what we call Amiyya at home that getting them to kind of Fusha A5 Amiyya is more challenging than having someone who doesn't know any Arabic and just only teaching them Fusha. So it's kind of comparable with tajweed. Like if somebody has been reciting without as good tajweed as they could for such a long time, and they get kind of grounded in those habits for a long time, it may end up feeling like you have to kind of relearn all the Quran you've memorized again, but with correct tajweed, perhaps. So I'd say that it's a foundation of reciting the Quran correctly.
What was it that you chose? Why was it that you chose Islam instead of other religions? Why did you revert? Alhamdulillah, we're happy that you did. Why? Your sister's asking why Islam in particular? What was your reason?
So the answer is that the Quran doesn't exist in other religions. That's the answer, that the Quran is the answer. That is the main character of this whole story, the Quran is. Like if I were to kind of, if I were to try to kind of put my finger on something else, it would just be how universal Islam is. Like the fact that we have a religion that we believe has always existed, and that people from all different cultures have embraced and will embrace and continue to embrace it and learn about it. Like that's actually something quite unique. Like when we grow up in it as Muslims, we often don't appreciate how universal that is. Like the idea of all of these prophets all kind of being one ummah, right? Like that's something so universal and kind of beautiful that that Allah Azza wa Jalla in His mercy and in His izzah and His might can reach into the depths of like Cornwall, where I'm from, and guide a little white kid who's 17 to Islam and facilitate that. Like, that's, even brothers, like, we should take a second just to ponder on what has been achieved by Islam at this point. Like, the fact that we can sit in a masjid in London and we can hear the adhan, like the same adhan that Bilal radiallahu anhu announced to the Muslims 1,400 years ago. The fact that this legacy, regardless of what attacks there have been against the Muslims, the laziness of the Muslims, that Islam has the victory whether you want it or not. That's something that we should sit and we should think about, how Islam has their izzah. Remember, even like in the months of Ramadan, there's that common dua that we all hear, Allahumma izz al-Islam wal Muslimin. Like, we ask Allah for izzah for Islam and for the Muslimin. We can understand why it's for the Muslimin, because people can achieve izzah, people can achieve greatness. But what does it mean to have izzah for Islam, if not for the Muslims? Well, it's this, my brothers and sisters, is that individuals can come to Islam without ever meeting you lot. People like myself can come to Islam purely because of Islam and not even because of the Muslims, right? That Islam itself has izzah, even without the Muslims. So, yeah.
Did anybody give you dawah, or did you learn, or did you did you just wake up? Pardon my opinion, I'm not trying to mock or whatever. Did you just say to yourself like, okay, I'm just going to revert into Islam? What made you come to the first place? What attacked?
So in the first place, it is the melody of the Quran. Now that's really that's the seed that's planted in my heart to bring me to Islam. But then around that, it's because, as well as I mentioned, like I was studying world religions at college, so I studied other religions. So there is like a study of Islam going on alongside this. Yeah. But from a non-Muslim, like, I'm learning like what the pillars of Islam are, what like the key beliefs of Islam are, and things like that. But even if it wasn't for those things, I think I had a drive at that time to learn about Islam and to accept it almost regardless. But no, nobody gave me da'wah. I mentioned there was one brother who's the same age as me. Like, I'm good friends with him now, actually. But he was like a friend of a friend, like quite close. Like, a friend of a friend isn't like, it wouldn't be awkward to speak to a friend of a friend. And he knew that I was learning about Islam. He even knew that I'd become a Muslim at this point, and never came and spoke to me. The first time he spoke to me was after I had done the khutbah in our masjid in Cornwall. And he came to me afterwards and he was like, oh, so you're a Muslim then? Yeah, and he was like, oh, so you're a Muslim then? I was like, oh, yeah, no thanks to you. I mean, all the opportunity that he had. Allah knows best, of course, but maybe I'd have taken my shahada with him on the tennis court in college, maybe, if he had done something differently. Do you know what I mean? But, you know, qadar Allahu ma shafa'an. I might be a professional rugby player now. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. The reason I say that is because I played like quite high, like in rugby in Cornwall is really popular. Like, it's more popular than football down there. And I played for our county team, and there's guys who play for England now who no, union. We don't play league that far south, but they love rugby league up north. But yeah, there's guys who play for the England team now who I was picked ahead of to play for Cornwall. There's a guy called Jack Noel who's a winger for England now, and when we did our trials for Cornwall, I was in the A team and he was in the B team. So like, but I mean, he's got a bit better than me since then, to be fair. So maybe I wouldn't have been, but I don't know. It's complete speculation, really, Akhi. I'm thinking about what possibly might have been different, but I don't know. Go ahead. Sorry? Oh, structure, massively. Like, without Islam, without our salah, without a commitment to some of these principles that we have as Muslims, like, I really don't think I'd have the structure or the drive to learn the things that I had. I don't see myself learning languages without Islam, having the drive, and because I learn languages for a couple of reasons. Like, obviously with the Quran, like Arabic was kind of the obvious one, right? But there's this ayah in Surah Al-Rum, I believe, where Allah says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ. That from His signs are the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity in your languages and your and your skin colors, right? Like there's a beauty in the diversity of our languages, and you know, I don't think I'd have had the drive to do those things. I don't think I'd be married with children either. Like it's a real blessing and something really necessary in our times. I think that Islam encourages the youth to marry. Like that's something that we are going in a direction that I think is regrettable, to be honest, among our youth, that we're thinking it's a good idea to delay marriage and have fewer children and later. And I don't think I would have done that if I hadn't have embraced Islam.
So you said that the melody of the Quran is what guided you to Islam, but how did it go from a point where it was just listening to the Quran, yeah, it sounds nice, and to actually realizing that Islam is the haq? Like I know a lot of people who look into Islam and they ask like, what are some miracles that prove that Islam is the right religion, or give me some facts that don't exist. But how was it for you, just an idea of like when did it become the haq through just listening to the Quran?
I suppose it became the haqq for me when I realized what influence the Quran had had over my life before I'd even studied it properly. Like the fact that I was at a point where the Quran had captured my attention to the point where I was wanting to learn its language, and I was dedicated to it in a way that I never had been with rugby or anything I had been before. So I was convinced that there was just something amazing about this book. It wasn't sort of, you know, I remember kind of watching YouTube videos about miracles in the Quran, and I suppose by the time I came across those, I was already convinced though. So those just kind of affirmed my conviction, really, I suppose.
So you're saying it's more of like Hidayah, like something from God that was brought into you that made you want to become Muslim?
I'm saying exactly that, yeah. Yeah, like it, yeah, that's exactly it.
One sister is asking, the changes over from a different culture, like the Western culture to a Muslim culture. How did you find it? And what would your tips be to brothers here and the sisters upstairs?
The Muslim doesn't think like the non-Muslim. That's definitely something that maybe a lot of you guys who are raised upon Islam, maybe you don't appreciate. Like I remember consciously noticing a completely, like a change in perspective completely from like when I was a non-Muslim to realizing I was like becoming a Muslim. Like simply the principle of Allah being the creator and us being his slaves. That's at the core of it, really, because in like our Western culture that we're raised in, even us who live in the UK, even if we're Muslims, like we're raised almost with the opposite, that we are the master who can vote, and we are the master who's free, and we are the master who can do what we like, right? Like, and becoming a Muslim, like, and a realization of that haqq is maybe, that's perhaps one of the greatest things. It's something that and the reason why that's so like on my mind now is a bit of a recency bias, because I've seen loads of my friends and family like pick up a copy of the Quran, and the thing that surprises them the most about it, when they do what I mentioned most of us from our culture do, is we read it from the front. I remember my brother coming through to my house and saying, like, I've read some of this Quran you've given me. It's not really selling it to me, is it? Like, why does it say in the beginning, you know, why does it say Hudan lil muttaqeen, like this is a guidance for like the God conscious, or whatever the translation says. Like, it's not really selling it to me. Like, why doesn't it say, oh, if you join this religion, then you'll get these things, and like, why isn't it doing like that? Like, we live in a world that's so used to being, where we're so used to being sold to, we're so used to us being the master, whereas like, but the whole, perhaps one of the main messages of Surah Al-Fatiha is the opposite of that, is that Allah is the master and we are his slaves. And a true realization of that, of the reality of the children of Adam, that is an empowerment. Right, that's realizing that truth is an empowerment for us. So, I suppose making that flip from feeling like you're the master to worshipping the master is a very brief answer to that, I suppose.
Jazakallah khair. We'll take one more question, inshallah.
We can try, inshallah. We can try.
You can do it now between you two, inshallah.
What were some of the things you had to give up coming into Islam? What was the benefit of doing so?
So something that I thank Allah Azza wa Jal for is that He saved me from a lot of sins because I was so young. Like I wasn't really old enough to have serious girlfriends or drink or anything like that really. Like, you know, most people who don't have Islam or any kind of guidance experience those things to some degree when they're younger, but not like, it doesn't really become your lifestyle when you're still a kid. Like, you know, as I say, I was 17, so I never really had an opportunity to become really entrenched in things like, you know, yeah, having girlfriends or drinking or, those are the main ones that kind of come to mind. Giving up greed, generally like in the month of Ramadan, that was hard, but that's hard, that's hard, especially here when we have longer Ramadans. Like my first Ramadan was in 2010, and the whole of Ramadan was the whole of August, and I was working in a cafe for the whole of that month, because like in Cornwall, especially in the village where I'm from, like you send the kids to work in the summer, like we have loads of hotels and restaurants and stuff that are all open to tourists and stuff in the summer, so like you just send your kids off to the local hotel or local shops or whatever, and I was working in a cafe, and I love coffee, and so I'm serving coffee for like all day, and Ramadan's the whole of August that year, so you know that was difficult. But as I said, like in my story, there's so much like certainty wrapped up in the story. Like at no point did I ever let it question whether I was doing the right thing. Like sometimes just some of those difficulties more kind of empowered me really. It was like if I can overcome these things, if I can pass these tests, then it means that I'm better in a sense. So yeah, that'd be my answer.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Sam, for sharing us the story.
Last one is like from a sister. She's saying, how would you give advice to those non-Muslims who come to Islam? What was the message you would give? And just say how you would just say, come to Islam, don't think about people, what other people think, because that's not good. Another thing is like, if you want to go watch Alaska, it's not scary. The shows on the telly. I've had the Allah gave me the tawfiq to go there, and it's nothing as scary as the people make it out. Inshallah, make it.
Jazakallah khairan. Well, regarding the question about giving the da'wah, I suppose I would defer to people who do this for a living. That the brothers at IERA, like they have a go-rap system that takes people through, you know, God, oneness, and what's the rap bit? Revelation and prophethood, I think it is. But with that, like, because I've been through that a number of times with my family members, and the thing that I think we could maybe focus on a little bit more is the actual scripture, like the revelation part of it. Because I sometimes get through convincing my family of God, convincing my family that if there's a God, then He's one, and convincing my family that if He's one, then He must have a will and has sent revelation, and then you know, and then with revelation, who's brought them, and prophets, right? And we get through the end of that, and they kind of accept it, and sort of like, well, what now? But really, the bit in the revelation needs to be focused on a little bit more in that. Like, if you do get to that stage, it needs to be, well, like, you know, Allah says it's quite serious that you become a Muslim, really. Like, that Yawm al-Qiyamah is on its way, and because a lot of the time people are kind of in this journey of wanting to become a Muslim, and they feel like there's time. Like they feel like they've got all the time in the world to embrace Islam if they fancy it or not. Or like, I had a call with someone last night actually, someone from Cornwall who is basically convinced of Islam, but like his words on the phone were like, I just want to talk to you to see if Islam's for me, or like what things can I read over the next few months to see if it's right for me. And you might not have time. You might not have that much time. And you know, so I kind of took that opportunity to remind him of people that maybe he's heard of people who have died immediately and suddenly. Like maybe he knows of people who have, even like children, young people who have died unexpectedly. Like that's quite a heavy conversation to have with a non-Muslim. So that's why I say you need to have got to that point though. There needs to be someone who's convinced of Allah, convinced of the oneness, convinced of the revelation. But I think we could do a little bit more to say what the revelation actually says. You know, there's the ayah that comes to mind in Surah Al-Qiyamah. وَيَقُولُ الْإِنسَانُ يَوْمَئِذٍ أَيْنَ الْمَفَرُ. That like on that day, mankind will say, like, where's the escape? أَيْنَ الْمَفَرُ. there's not a mafar. There's no escape. So I suppose a closing remark, or maybe I'll make if there aren't any more questions, is please make dua for the people who are sat on the stages and the people who are speaking into the microphones. Because sometimes we think that these people who are on the YouTube videos and people who are giving da'wah and stuff, they're people who have got things put together, but they're not in front of you because they're perfect, or they're not in front of you because they're better than you even. They're really just in front of you because they've got something to say. And having something to say doesn't mean that they've got good hearts necessarily, or that they don't have sins. So, I'd like to ask you just to make a little sincere dua, even just for me personally as well, to keep me sincere. Because when you have people looking at you like this, believe me, shaitan would love to steal the reward from me. For me to have some kind of other motive in it, shaitan would love to steal the reward from you if you're looking at me in a certain way which is envious or whatever, right? Like, shaitan would love to ruin the gatherings like this. So we should maybe end by remembering Allah Azza wa Jal, asking Him that He keep us sincere in our pursuits, and may Allah increase us all in knowledge. Ameen.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Sam, for sharing us your amazing story of your journey to Islam. I pray that Allah keeps us steadfast with His deen and guides us to the right path. Jazakallah khair. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Yeah.